Chapter 5 starts talking about the physical and electrical properties of cells in the nervous system. So we have billions of cells in our nervous system, and most of them are neurons. But of the three major cell types in the nervous system, we have neurons, which are nerve cells. They do everything. They're the worker bees of the nervous system. We have glia, which are cells that support neurons, and some of them send signals, and we'll talk about them. And then stem cells, which are the precursors for both neurons and glia. So we're not going to talk very much about stem cells, but just know that they're all derived from the same neural stem cells. So for the learning objectives for this part, I want you to be able to name and describe the parts of a neuron and the synapse and their functions. So the parts that you should know the definitions for are listed right here and in the module in Canvas. You should be able to describe the distinguishing features of different types of neuron structures, bipolar, pseudo-unipolar, and multipolar neurons, and to be able to give an example of each in the body. You should name the three functional groups of neurons and the type of information they carry and the direction that that information goes in. You should be able to describe axialplasmic transport, including anterograde and retrograde transport, with regard to the direction the transport goes in the neuron and which substances are transported. When we start talking about the electrical and chemical features of the cell, you should be able to list three major ions that contribute to the resting membrane potential of a nerve cell, and three ways the ion distribution between the inside and the outside of the cell is maintained, so the inside is more negative than the outside at rest. And that's really important to maintaining the excitability of nerve cells. You should know how membrane channels influence the electrical potential across the cell membrane, and then be able to define the stimulus that's required to open the four different types of membrane channels that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So neurons, they are really the main jobs that they do are receiving information, processing information, transmitting the information to another cell, and then transferring that to the next cell in the line. So that's their job. They're specialized to receive, process, and transmit information. Just like every other cell in the body, they have organelles. They have the nucleus and Golgi bodies and mitochondria, lysosomes, and endoplasmic reticulum. So they have all the same cellular structures, but they have some specialized structure that we'll talk about. So the nucleus and the Golgi apparatus and the rough ER where RNA is translated into proteins are restricted to the soma of the neuron. And then other organelles are distributed throughout the neuron. So there are mitochondria throughout the neuron that are producing ATP to use in different procedures and structures and things that the neuron has to do. Of course, like every other cell in the body, it's surrounded by that plasma membrane, which separates the extracellular environment from the cell contents. So in a lot of ways, they're the same as other cells, but in a lot of ways, they're also different. So a typical neuron has four main components: the soma, the dendrites, the axon, and the presynaptic terminal. So the soma is the body of the neuron. And it's the cell body, basically. And so when we see gray matter in imaging or in photographs, the gray matter is the soma and the dendrites of the neuron. The dendrites are the receiving station for cells. They're branch-like extensions that serve as the main input sites for the cell. The axon is the output unit of the cell. It's specialized to send information to other neurons, muscle cells, or glands. Most neurons have a single axon that arises from a specialized organ of the cell that's called the axon hillock. So the axon hillock is the region of the cell where the axon sprouts. and then goes off to contact other cells. The presynaptic terminal is the transmitting element of the neuron. It's at the end of the axon. The presynaptic terminals, that's where the neurotransmitters are released. Neurotransmitters are information chemicals that are released from presynaptic terminals to pass on to the next cell. So neurons transmit information about their activity via those neurotransmitters that are released from presynaptic terminals. The space between a presynaptic terminal and the next cell is called the synapse, and the synaptic cleft is actually, there's no physical contact besides neurotransmitters between the two cells. There's actually that synaptic cleft. It's the site for interneuronal communication and where neurons contact other cells. The postsynaptic terminal is the receiving end of interneuronal communication. So the postsynaptic terminal might be on the dendrite of another neuron. It might be on the soma of another neuron. It could be on the axon of another neuron, or it could be a muscle cell or gland that's going to respond to this information that the neuron is sending. But all in all, the basic neurons' functions are reception or input, receiving input, integration, so processing that input, transmission along the axon and across the synapse, and transfer of information to another neuron, a muscle cell, or a gland. So that's what neurons live to do. That's the job they do for us. So even though the components of neurons are standard, they're organized different ways depending on the type of neuron involved and what it needs to do. So there are several different types of neurons, and we're going to talk about sort of the major ones. A bipolar cell is a cell that has two primary processes extending from the cell body. An example of that in the body is the retinal bipolar cell in the eye. Multipolar cells have a single axon with multiple dendrites, and spinal motor neurons are a big example of that. They project from the spinal cord to innervate skeletal muscle fibers. The classification of neurons is derived from the number of structures that arise from the cell body. So this is a graphic from the book that shows different types of neuron. Letter A is the bipolar neuron with dendrite and an axon. Letter B is what's called a pseudo-unipolar neuron, and we'll talk about that in a second, where it has two axons and no true dendrites. The multipolar neuron is letter C, where there's zillions of dendrites and one axon. Letter D is another version of a multipolar neuron. So letter C is a spinal motor neuron, and letter D is a Purkinje cell in the cerebellum. And these guys aren't to scale. So the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum aren't exactly the same size as the spinal motor neurons, but in this graphic it looks like they are. And then letter E is this tiny little interneuron, which is a bipolar neuron, basically. It has dendrites or a multipolar neuron, it has dendrites and an axon. So the bipolar cells, they have those two primary structures that extend from the cell body, the dendritic root, which divides into multiple dendritic branches, and the axon, which projects to form presynaptic terminals. So we're always going to talk about neurons projecting, and that means they go somewhere. That's where they're sending their information. So there's a subclass of bipolar cells that's called a pseudo-unipolar cell, and they appear to have a single projection from the cell body that divides into two axonal roots. So they have two axons and no true dendrites. So the sensory neurons, the peripheral axon, transmits information from the cell body or from the peripheral receptors to the cell body, and then the central axon conducts information from the cell body to the spinal cord. So it's just a way of describing those. So our sensory receptor neurons from the periphery, those are the pseudo-unipolar cells. So when we were talking about those A beta fibers, when we were talking about electrical stim, a lot of those guys are pseudo-unipolar cells. So the cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, the peripheral axon is bringing in information from the receptor, and the central axon is taking it up to the thalamus, where it's going to process that information and give us some sensory awareness of it. Multipolar cells have a single axon and multiple dendrites arising from many regions of the cell body. So the multipolar cells are the most common cells in the vertebrate nervous system, and they have a variety of shapes and organizations. They're specialized to receive and accommodate a large amount of synaptic input. So a spinal neuron innervating a skeletal muscle receives as many as 8,000 synaptic contacts on its dendrites. Purkinje cells in the cerebellum can receive as many as 150,000 contacts from synapses on its dendrites, and also on the cell body itself. So multipolar cells are receiving and processing a huge amount of information. There are a couple videos in the Canvas module that you can see these different types of cells and their function. So there are three functional groups of neurons based on the direction of information flow. Afferent neurons are mostly sensory neurons. They carry sensory information from the outer body, from the periphery, towards the central nervous system. Efferent neurons are largely motor neurons, and they relay commands from the central nervous system to smooth and striated muscles and to glands. Interneurons, they process information locally, or they convey information short distances like spinal reflexes. So interneurons act throughout the nervous system, either processing that information locally or conveying the information short distances, and it's the largest class of neurons. Most of the neurons in our cerebral cortex are interneurons, and we have a lot in the spine as well, because those are areas where information's being passed between a lot of neurons and being processed. So axialplasmic transport is a mechanism for transporting substances along the axon. So the movement of substances from the soma along the axon towards the presynaptic terminal is called anterograde transport. And moving from the presynaptic terminal back to the soma is called retrograde transport. So the types of substances that are moved up and down the axon are neurotransmitters, of course, and then substances required to nourish the axon. So just like all cells in the body, it needs nourishment. So anterograde is from the soma towards the presynaptic terminal, and retrograde is from the synapse back to the soma. Axialplasmic transport occurs at many speeds, but it slows as part of aging. It also slows in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Huntington's, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So my analogy for axialplasmic transport is it's like a handle toe at a ski area. So the little synaptic vesicles filled with neurotransmitters hold on to the little protein handle, and they're towed down to the presynaptic terminal where the neurotransmitter gets released, and then they catch right onto the rope tow and they get towed back to the lodge or the soma. So the anterograde transport is going out to the presynaptic terminal, and retrograde transport back to the soma. And they recycle those synaptic vesicles, the soma does, and it refills it with neurotransmitters and then sends it down the handle toe again.